Yeah. Hello, good morning. Good morning.
Good morning.
We'll just
Good to see you all.
We'll just give people one more minute because we're a fraction ahead of time. What time is it there, Aroosa? Is it early afternoon?
Yes, it's 1:30.
So you're 4 hours ahead of us. Yes.
Consecutive 7 hours of power cut.
All right. So how are you functioning then?
It's just UPS. We have that as a backup. So
what is UPS?
It's kind of like, you have an extra generator and the batteries to run the electricity and the other stuff. Yeah. Can't turn on my AC though, but otherwise it's okay.
So fingers crossed, you're not suddenly going to disappear.
I hope I won't disappear all of a sudden. Yeah, no, I think it's going to be okay.
Brilliant. All right. Have we got... Oh, no, lots of nice familiar faces from yesterday. I don't know if Layla... Yes, Layla's here. Raha's here. Okay, I think we'll get started. So welcome back to many of you. I see lots of familiar names in the participants list, and also a warm welcome to our Post-Millennial MENAWA conference for delegates who are coming in fresh today. We had a brilliant time yesterday. We've all had a little bit of sleep now, and we look forward to continuing the conversation about Post-Millennial MENAWA, new approaches to literature, translation, and creative expression. If you were here yesterday, then you know the drill. If not, the housekeeping items are, please mute your mics and use the hand raise function if you wish to ask a question in person after the talk. Questions can alternatively be put in the chat at any point, and I, as the chair of this session, will feed them in. I have a backup for this. We will continue to run tightly to schedule today, so if you're in a panel later on, chairs will raise their hand like this when you reach your allotted time, just so that you know. If you tweet, we'd love you to use the hashtag Post-Millennial MENAWA, which one of my colleagues will put in the chat. Too many L's, too many N's in that word. After the conference ends, we're going to survey your 3 favorite papers in ranked order in order to allocate some lovely prizes. And after yesterday, for sure, this is going to be a tough decision. I already have 3 favorites and we've got a whole day to go. But without further ado, I'm delighted to introduce our second keynote speaker at the conference, Dr Aroosa Kanwal from the International Islamic University, Islamabad in Pakistan, from where she joins us this morning / afternoon, because it's early afternoon for Aroosa. Despite several hours of power cuts, so she clearly has magical powers as well as good technology. Aroosa is one of the foremost experts on Pakistani literature in English, editor of the Routledge Companion to Pakistani Anglophone Writing, 2019, author of Rethinking Identities in Contemporary Pakistani Fiction Beyond 9/11, 2015, which received the 2015 Karachi Literature Festival Award for the Best Nonfiction Book that year, as well as, of course, numerous articles and chapters on Pakistani and Muslim fiction. Aroosa is currently working on 2 Routledge contracted monographs, one with a transnational, indeed trans-regional focus, I believe. She is also co-investigator and Pakistan node leader for the AHRC-funded Muslim Women Popular Genres project, as well as editor of the Journal for Contemporary Poetics. And somehow she also manages to teach full-time and do all of the other things. Aroosa completed her PhD at Lancaster some time ago and returned as a visiting fellow a couple of years ago. So it is our particular pleasure to welcome her back today, albeit virtually. And we look forward to her keynote paper entitled Frozen Grief, Muslim Geographies of Invisibility and Silence. Thank you, Aroosa, and welcome.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Lindsay, for your very warm, generous introduction. And I'm very thankful for being invited to give this keynote. And my apologies in advance for starting your day with such a grim paper. As Lindsay said that, I'm currently working on a few book projects, and today's talk is part of a larger book project that I'm currently working on. In relation to the post-colonial Muslim world, which I argue has become a geography of dehumanization, invisibility, and silence in the wake of institutionalized and diverse acts of violence committed against Muslims in Kashmir, Palestine, China, Syria, Pakistan, and Iraq. And I'm interested in the ways in which this unhuman condition engenders its own forms of inhumanity by articulating an alternative forms of non-subjectivity that justifies an urgent need to deal with a new enemy, in this case, the Muslim other. In today's world, politics, whether under the guise of war, violence, slow death, or the war against terrorism, makes the murder of the enemy its absolute objective. And this kind of institutional violence has continued to be directed towards a range of populations of Muslim origin. For example, the treatment of Muslims at the hands of US military in Guantanamo Bay detention cells, Abu Ghraib, Bagram, the use of pellet guns by Indian military against Kashmiri Muslims, the use of drone and chemical warfare in Palestine and North Waziristan in Pakistan, genocide of Uyghur community in China, the massacres of Rohingya Muslims in Myanmar, and atrocities experienced by tribal Pashtuns in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa at the hands of state and fundamentalist Taliban. Also think about the politics of border control and the status of Syrian and Iraqi refugees and asylum seekers in both Muslim and European host countries, which signify embodiment of a condition of unbelonging encoded within a concept of citizenship. So these refugees, they are bound to live as their lives in camp spaces against the backdrop of a state of exception measures, which have been widely used since 9/11 attacks and subsequent war on terror. So I argue that people who have been evicted from the political community since then have largely been Muslims and Arab immigrants to Europe and America, Palestinians and Abu Ghraib and Guantanamo prisoners, who have not been stigmatized as culturally different, but also denied membership of the polity. And this kind of political vulnerability contributes to the process of demonizing Muslim populations because the violence unleashed on their bodies is conveniently silenced or frozen and hence made invisible through a discursive and enunciative frame in such a way that appropriation and performative production of Islamic spaces not only create the geography of the war on terror, but also continue to justify the enactment of multimodal violence. Derek Gregory aptly calls these spaces killing grounds and suggests that the material reality of war, which is the fields of violence, and the representational regimes through which it operates, which is the field of vision, they're all but inseparable. Gregory's observations corroborate Agamben's argument that such a representational discourse not only erases or distorts the actual histories of these lands, but also reduces the entire Muslim population to homine sacrae, bodies imagined as lying not only outside the realm of law's protection, but also the realm of humanity itself. And it is precisely for this reason that through the nexus of thanatopolitics, the politics of invisibilization and strategies of violence, I try to explain why tropes of dehumanization and slow death are so prevalent in post-colonial literature, especially the ways in which technologies of suppression and control justify a logic of erasure. So out of all these regions, which are basically the focus of my larger book project, today I will talk about the case of Kashmir. As we all know that the issue of Kashmiri sovereignty and separatist rebellion has been underway in the region since 1989, which brought Kashmiris out onto the streets of Srinagar for the sake of Azadi, freedom. But since then, Kashmiri's desire for Azadi was dealt with a nationalist Indian slogan, दूध मांगोगे तो खीर देंगे, Kashmir मांगोगे तो चीर देंगे. Ask for milk, we'll give you cream. Ask for Kashmir, we'll rip you open seam to seam. Territorial disputes between the two countries over Kashmir issue continue, but the Indian state ripped off Kashmir on 5th August 2019 by revoking Article of 370 of Constitution, depriving them of their semi-autonomous status in the Muslim-majority region. And most importantly, this move aims to change Kashmir's Muslim majority demographics to pernicious body politics in order to regulate the citizenship of Kashmiris. This nexus between biological and political existence, where Indian sovereign state is controlling the bodies of Kashmiris as a way of achieving hegemony, is evident from two exceptional local policies that are defended as normal. First, the narcissistically necropolitical control over Kashmiri bodies over the last 2 decades achieved through widening the circle of exception to exclude more and more Kashmiris from having rights. And second, by sanctioning the entry of new Hindu residents into Jammu and Kashmir after revoking of Article 370, a kind of violence is unleashed against Kashmiris that will destroy their symbolic system of meaning, the meaning of having a Muslim majority area, and meaning of their struggle for independence. And the spatial stratification of physical space without legality in Indian conquered territory does not merely mark ownership of the land, but also, as Ananya Jahan Kabir says, the body in the landscape that forms the center of the Kashmiri struggle for dignity and self-determination. So the whole landscape of Jammu and Kashmir can only be described as death worlds after the valley is transformed into a maze of barbed wire barricades, a giant prison camp monitored and controlled by 700,000 Indian soldiers, against Indian paramilitary soldiers who aggressively use slingshots and pellet guns to blind innocent Kashmiris, the sangbaz, the stone pelters on the streets corners in Kashmir remind us of their intifada, the shaking off of the chains of occupation. These simmering tensions expressed via freedom rallies, uprising, and stone pelting had failed to capture the world's attention until the revoking of Article 370 on 5th August, because no one could imagine that certain human beings' civil, political, and human rights could disappear in a moment after the sovereign state decides to deploy its so-called self-preserving forces in the territory it is expected to protect. Indeed, this unconstitutional tactic in the form of the cancellation of Article 370 reinforces various mechanisms and imaginaries that are mobilized in the manufacturing of death worlds, spaces in which sovereignty operates not biopolitically, necropolitically, and metapolitically, but even beyond. In a public lecture, Imagining Politics as a Form of War, Mamby posed a pertinent yet problematic question. What place is given to life, death, and the human body, in particular the wounded or slain body? And how are they inscribed in the order of power? Here, the motive of slain body is important because it distances itself from Foucault's biopolitical paradigm of understanding power that views body in its capacity to live, and invest in such a body would require a certain maintenance of it. On the contrary, the body which is slain and wounded, recognized in Agamben's language as homo sacer, refers to a system and paradigms of power that do not target life in its capacity to live, but rather in its capacity to die. Did anyone realize why Kashmir crisis never captured world's attention as it should? It is because, can there be politics of life in terms of non-human or the unhuman? And what kind of politics or political claims could exist beyond human or humanity? In today's talk, I will actually focus on the two most common thanatopolitical strategies of dehumanization used against Muslim Kashmiris: enforced disappearance and pulverization of human, both of which not only seek to dehumanize the victim, but also aim to wipe their subjects from the horizon. Here, I'm not interested in reprising close connections between late modern geopolitics and necropolitics, as a lot has been said about it. I'll speak about the violence against Kashmiri Muslims that can be described as, to borrow Debrick's term, pulverization of the human, a radical form of violence that aims purely to destroy the uniqueness of the body, which is not merely the end of life, but the human condition itself. And this type of violence is conducive to an environment in which agonal sovereignty seeks to wipe its subject from the horizon, as it is quite evident from revoking of Article 370 now. Jabrix and Bata describe the agonal sovereignty as a configuration of power and force characterized by an ontopolitics of devastation of being, and the one which is specifically marked by a certain horror, as theorized by Cavarero in her book Horrorism, Naming Contemporary Violence. Horrorism, for Cavarero, is distinct from terrorism in two ways. First, it has the paralyzing effect of the gaze when confronted with the horrific, which is inconceivable, and the person is gripped with fear and horror and hence frozen. And secondly, it is linked with the violation of an individual's ontological dignity. And my preference for the use of the term horrorism instead of state terrorism for Indian states violence is also informed by a simultaneous openness of Kashmiri citizens to care and harm, as Cavarero puts it, who are irredeemably open to wounding and caring. Given this kind of ambivalent care-harm relationship between states as in Kashmir, I tend to agree with Cynthia Weber that the concept of horrorism complicates disciplinary understanding of contemporary violence, which tend to see only terrorism, but not horrorism in war, and which generally neglect to theorize how violence, particularly horrorism, is embedded in an exchange through state-citizen relationship. And this idea kind of makes much more sense in the light of Narendra Modi's justification for taking a historic decision of revoking Article 370, and I quote, "I and the whole nation have taken a historic decision, an arrangement in which our brothers and sisters from Jammu, Kashmir, and Ladakh had been deprived of their rights, which has been a great obstacle in their development, has been removed as a result of all our efforts." It is important to note that Modi's statement that apparently, or perhaps ironically, gestures towards biopolitical practices of power and violence in terms of preservation of life does in fact aim at the use of horrific forms of violence, a violence that is designed to immobilize and paralyze Kashmiri civilians. Through contemporary shock and awe fanatical strategies, the Indian state aims to traumatize the civilian through horroristic violence to the extent that they offer no opposition. But the most shocking aspect with regards to Kashmiri issue is that there is no humanity that stands up against the traumatic situation in Kashmir, because the horrific images of dying Kashmiris are rendered lifeless and purposeless by collapsing the unity and the integrity of the human body, which eventually becomes undistinguishable from non-human matter, which I will now explain with reference to the two novels which I've chosen for this talk. The reason for considering the two novels here is to emphasize the bitter reality that nothing has changed in Kashmir over the last 2 decades. Since Mirza Wahid's novel published in 2011 and Feroz Rader's in 2018, one capturing the 1990s and the other Kashmir almost a decade later, nothing has changed in the Valley of Kashmir. Set in the 1990s in the village of Nogam, Mirza Wahid's The Collaborator is the tale of an inexplicable violence, fear, and plight of Indian Kashmiris as the demand for Azadi gained momentum and narrators' 4 best friends snuck across the line of control for paramilitary training in Pakistan. The central protagonist of the novel is an unnamed 19-year-old Kashmiri whose life changes dramatically as he's employed by Captain Qadian, head of the local Indian army, to go down to the meadows to collect the ID cards and weapons of the guerrillas killed and dumped by the Indian army. The corpses and the bodies of militants are deliberately left to rot as dead meat near the border in order to send a message to the militants across the line of control. I quote, "Look, look, you backstabbing bastards. Here is your fucking jihad in a hideous heap. Look at it and squirm." A sense of profound dehumanization pervades the entire novel, in which human deaths are reduced to mere statistics. Feroz Rader's debut novel, The Night of Broken Glass, through the course of 13 interconnected stories set in Indian-occupied Jammu and Kashmir, also captures the Indian state's espoused monopoly on custodian killings of innocent Kashmiri civilians. The novel is replete with images of horrific killings, bodily disfigurations, and innumerable massacres that have continued to happen in Kashmir since 1948, but they became more pronounced in the early 90s. Incidents involving the disappearance of young boys who are incarcerated and killed in front of their parents, the inhuman treatment of budding Kashmiri youth in prisons, the gruesome accounts of shoot on sight are emblematic of contemporary agonal sovereignty in Indian-occupied Jammu and Kashmir. In the novel, the Betnoirs of this scandalous exercising of power and military surveillance are Major S and Inspector Masoodi, the true characters who make the reader realize the horrorism of the spectacle of disfigurement which the singular body cannot bear. In both novels, the target of this kind of agonal sovereignty are no longer human subjects, citizens, cells, but body parts, fragments of lives, bits and pieces of singular human experience, and their always readily reopened wounds and scars. For example, Wahid's fictional Kashmir, with its harvest of human remains, is shown to be dictated by corpse land etiquette, where a defiantly pitiless state actor, Captain Kadian, is recruited to carry out dehumanizing and hair-raising acts of horrorism that render the very idea of human pointless in the valley of Jammu and Kashmir. The novel's narrative is itself a vision of horror. What we encounter is not bodies, but flesh and dead meat, as Captain Kadian, while giving instructions to the narrator about collecting ID cards from the dead bodies, says, and I quote, "Look, they're just dead meat, and that's how I prefer them. They keep sneaking in, and we keep shooting their guts out of them at first sight. That's it. When they do fall to those machine guns out there, they just drop off the ridge like dolls, like cardboard fucking soldiers, one after the other, ping, ping. I see it all through these," unquote. Kadian's description of human remains and scattered flesh referred to as dead meat, dolls, and cardboard makes it hard to imagine if such a flesh is human or non-human. In other words, such a description fails to reveal substantial human traits or unity or integrity in these bodies, making it difficult to distinguish them from non-matter. Once the unity of the body is challenged by disfiguration or dismemberment and becomes unrecognizable and unidentifiable, so they fail to elicit any empathy in spectators simply because it loses the metaphysics of substance that serves to anchor body to the idea of unity and identity of being, which gives the human body a political and social presence and hence an identity. But having transcended their humanity in terms of any biopolitical or even necropolitical perspectives, the fragments of bodies in Wahid's novel can be envisioned as the one beyond identitarian politics, which requires a human body with a clear, recognizable identity. When the narrator, whose sole task is to find IDs of the dead bodies, visits corpse land, he is immediately horrified at the prospects of what his first job entails. And he remains unsure how many dead remains he sees, since they are only ugly grains, unbelievable, almost inhuman postures, and grotesque intermingling of broken limbs, limbless, armless, even headless torsos. More tellingly, the sanctity and the dignity of the dead body, which in the Muslim context is expressed by saying Fatiha, is denied to these bodies in the novel because, as the narrator says, nothing much remains of them anyway. Poor statues in bone with miserable looks that have frozen in time, half legs astride of their torsos. What if all the animals of the neighborhood have taken to eating rotting human flesh? And what if all the cats and all the dogs, all the wolves from the forest and all the foxes from the fields, the tigers, all the rats, all of them tearing their meals off young men like me? What is horrific about this description is that in the process of making anonymous, the bodies lose their individuality through, using Kalal Asad's words, the sudden shattering and mingling of physical objects and human bodies, both of which render the image and the scene of horror unwatchable and unrepresentable. And it is because of this incongruity of the vulnerable body with its rawness of exposed and mangled flesh, that these bodies fail to retain human dignity and hence fail to elicit any sympathy. The Night of Broken Glass brings another dimension of horrorism, and that is the offending the ontological dignity of a human figure to the reconfiguration of human parts into something alien, monstrous, and unbearable. In a chapter entitled The Boss's Account, the boatsman is transmogrified into an earless monster, a unilateral violence that dismembers his human figure, making it unwatchable. This entire crime is staged as an intentional offense to the ontological dignity of the victim. Feroz rather captures this hair-raising butchery as a habitual crime or by the Indian Army to disrupt the politics of invisibility surrounding the carnage in Kashmir. After investigating the boatman for committing the crime of ferrying young boys across the river, when Sunil brings him out to the veranda, and I quote from the text, Major S was sitting there having a snack. He smiled as Sunil nodded at him and cordially asked me to sit down in the chair beside him. He summoned his cook and told him to give him a cup of tea. I was terrified, but he seemed genuinely friendly. Suddenly, before the tea arrived, he turned and grabbed my neck and shoved my face onto the patio table by the bowl of snacks. I don't quite remember how I felt at that moment. He wiped out a knife with a tremendous speed and sliced it across my ear. He kicked me from behind and I fell to the ground, squirming in agony, my hands covering the bleeding sides of my head. Major S folded the penknife with a snap and put it back into his pocket. He calmly pushed aside the bloodied potato chips aside and fished out a clean silver from the bowl and ate it. Such a confounding of the figure of boatsman's body, the violence of the human hands that had cut off the ears and mutilated the body, boatsman's beauty, that perpetually turns him into an earless monster, not only prevents his return to the image of human body, but also reconfigures his body as something without meaning to humanity. A similar unwatchable experience of the confounding of human body is captured by Wahid in the figure of Shaban Khatana, an elderly village handyman. What is significant about Shaban Khatana's story is that the horroristic violence which results in dismemberment of his human figure is not committed by Indian soldiers, but by Islamic militants. Although Islamic militants in the novel are shown to reciprocate the Indian army crackdowns and extrajudicial killing, Wahid does not shy away from rejecting the common position of both Indian and Pakistani sides in a dispute over the province of Kashmir, which involves sadistic nationalist and statist fervor on display over what is described by Kabir as the territory of desire. The novel equally criticizes Islamic militants trained in Pakistan, who also mime and torture and are depicted as guilty parties who have inflicted some sufferings on Kashmir and its people. For example, believing that Shaban Khatana has betrayed them, the Inqilabis, Islamic Inqilabis, inflict excruciating torture on him while calling him Ghaddar Gujjar, who looked like a chicken fluttering its wing under the knife's edge. The boy took out a long, large knife and then in a swift blow of its blade, sliced off a part of father's nose. Next, they grabbed mother by her headscarf and chopped off a part of her ears. They didn't believe much. And then they tore off the tip of her tongue. This tearing of the tongue symbolically gestures towards a great silence that pervades their house, their community, their village, and by extension, the spectators of the world. But what happened when the very idea of being human or humanity is challenged not by confounding of shapes, but by depriving the body of its humanness by severing the human body's head? The act of beheading gestures towards the immediate termination of life force or the forceful removal of our human face from the commonly shared humanity. Such beheadings violate the rules of body's grammar, something that Regina Janes calls catachresis. For Janes, the head is that part of the body that helps to identify a human body, an individual, a unique person, and guarantees the presence of human life force. A severed head not only divorces the body of its human vitality, integrity, and life force, but by undoing its figural unity, but also snatches its social and political identity. In other words, the severed head, as categorizes, is aborted communication and a mark of no longer operational human community. And this point is significant in relation to the ways in which Indian state is spreading horror in Jammu and Kashmir to make it no longer operational human community. One of the most plangent and evocative accounts of this form of horrorism is depicted in Collaborator to the character of Farooq Khan, who is arrested and tortured mainly on suspicion of being an associate of militants. Although he poses no threat to the state's safety, the third-degree interrogation methods of violence the Indian state actors direct against Farooq makes him a tourist site of horrorism by piercing a red-hot knitting needle through his penis, stuffing a bamboo cane with hot chili powder and thrust it up his anus, and by making him drink their collective urine after keeping him thirsty for days. But the violence didn't stop here. Farooq was arrested a second time, and 3 days later, his head was hurled over the fence into the front garden of their house. Farooq's head, reduced to a motionless object, covered by white chadar, was indeed thrown as a warning to potential collaborators, but it left the narrator wondering, why did they have to do that? Why not just kill him? These questions draw our attention to the political significance of such acts of horror that focus on the destruction of bodies. First, the act of beheading signifies horror and fury beyond beheading, or as Daybreak says, that in a spectrally reappearing form, it comes back as hallucinated aberration, a horrific disturbance and interruption, stripping them of any heroic context. For example, the gruesome violence represented via Farooq's decapitated head looms forth in a tragic parody of the act of beheading when, a few days later, Firdaus Ali's 6-year-old son starts playing out a beheading game at home, marking his sister's throat round and round with a ballpoint pen. His sister had refused to sleep ever since. She just lay on her mattress, hands covering her throat, and stayed awake all night. For days, Firdaus keeps trying to get her daughter to sleep, but the daughter completely becomes hysterical if anyone tries to remove her hands from her throat. Therefore, the severed head of Farooq becomes a trope for vulnerability to convey an uncanny feeling that death is inescapably close to anyone dreaming of any heroic deed of joining the freedom movement. Therefore, the materiality of the wounded body is complicit in the derealization of the victim, ensuring that certain bodies are not recognizable as social and political human bodies. Instead, they are merely assemblages of body parts stripped of anything that might identify them as individual, worthy of our compassion and respect. Judith Butler flags up a dilemma. If a violence is done against those who are unreal, then from the perspective of violence, it fails to injure or negate those lives, since those lives are already negated. And if certain lives do not qualify as lives or are from the start not conceivable as lives within certain epistemological frames, then these lives are neither lived nor lost in a full sense. And this is precisely what can be argued for Kashmiris. Their right and struggle to maintain their unique social and political reality have been denied over the last 2 decades through necropolitical and theraноpolitical strategies in the form of pellet guns or chemical weapons, cluster bombs. But this contemporary politics surrounding the horrorist pulverization of Kashmiri bodies intend to prepare the world to conceive of Kashmiris as devoid of substance. And this is proven by the absolute silence of the world on Kashmir crisis for the last 2 decades. As a result of this silence, the humanity of the Kashmiris is finally challenged by the act of beheading, that is, by annihilation through Article 370 on 5th August 2019. In his essay, Jake Schrensier warns us against the danger of Vaneshtum, a German term for the extreme form of will to deny that human tragedy ever happened. Vaneshtum for Schrensier is not just a negation, but a negation of the negations, or the annihilation of the annihilations, the disappearance of its traces, the disappearance of its very name. A key strength of Rancier's idea of disappearance is the emphasis on the process by which disappearance is produced, right down to its disappearance. And that is the ways in which disappearance disappears. Something which I now intend to focus on to the horrors of their enforced disappearance in the Valley of Jammu and Kashmir. which is not only a war crime, but a crime against humanity. Since the act of disappearance seriously undermines the rule of law, which corroborates Agamben's idea of extrajudicial killing in a state of exception, I call this Indian state-sponsored system enforced disappearance another form of horrorism. The way horroristic violence in the form of pulverization of the human body aims at silencing, immobilizing, and paralyzing the Kashmiri civilians by leaving them unrecognizable as human beings, trapping the affected families in a state of ambiguous loss through enforced disappearance, also serves to paralyze the broader society by inducing horror among the community, through which the state achieves threefold strategic benefits. First, through carefully executed plan of disappearance, the state authorities intimate dissident communities to create a panic in a society in order to eliminate any rebellion or destabilizing opposition forces against the state. Second, to make the death or the very existence of the person insignificant, which kind of resonates with the idea of dehumanization I've just discussed, through its invisibilization. And third, through performance of horror via forced disappearance, families are frightened and horrified to an extent that they fail to mourn the disappeared or even express the grief, a condition that I term frozen grief. As Rancière explains, the persistent hope of seeing the disappeared loved ones defers the grieving process ad infinitum. And this can give rise to so-called frozen grief, where mourning process is interrupted and remains on the perpetual standby, which serves to silence the voice of the victim, in this case, the families of the disappeared. And it is precisely this silence that is shattered in the works like Shehnaz Bashir's The Half-Mother. Set in 1990s Natipura near Srinagar, Shehnaz Bashir's debut novel, Half-Mother, particularly focuses on decades-old politics of enforced disappearance of husbands, fathers, brothers, and children during ongoing conflict in Kashmir. As a result of this explicit tactic of Indian state and its armed actors, between 2,500 and 3,000 women in Jammu and Kashmir have been declared as half-widows, a term which is used for women whose husbands have disappeared but have not been declared deceased. But I know this is an official figure. The unofficial figure actually extends up to like 20 to 40,000. This unmitigated crime unleashed on Kashmiri women have also devastated hundreds of mothers who have lost their sons to enforced disappearance. Bashir names these women half-mothers. One such untold and unheard story of a half-mother is presented in Bashir's novel through the character of Halima. Having lost her mother, Buba, to tuberculosis at the age of 8, abandoned by her husband after only 3 months of her marriage, and witnessing her father, Abjan's torturous killing at the hands of military, Halima becomes an epitome of valiance and resistance as she embarks on a never-ending search for her lone son, Imran. In this regard, Bashir says the half-mother is an imagined convergence of all the half-mothers out there in the world who are conveniently dehumanized in the Valley of Kashmir. David Smith argues that dehumanization allows perpetrators of enforced disappearance to treat their victims as simultaneously human and less than human, resulting in a perception of a dehumanized people as human subhuman chimeras. The incongruity that marked the depiction of Halima's character as half-mother quintessentially resonates with human subhuman status of the character of a mother in the novel, which I contend is also a means to disempower or disembody Halima. The trope of half-mother points to another very important dimension of disempowerment with reference to women in cultures and society that define them through the relationship with men. And this resonates with Kelman's theorization of the processes of dehumanization, which deprive individuals from humanness and subsequently exclude them from the human family, which sustains on the feeling of a sense of kinship. In this novel, while compiling the list of the members of the Association of Relatives of Disappeared Person, Advocate Farouk explains to the members that for certain cases of women whose husbands have disappeared, the legal language defines their status by using a prefix half. These will be called half-widows. Halima feels a cold pinch and confusingly asked Advocate Farouk, "And what about mothers, Farouk Sahab?" Halima asked, "Are they half-mothers by rule?" He didn't know how to respond to Halima. He couldn't be certain what status of victim should be assigned to her. So am I a half mother? Halima repeated. So just as half widows of the Kashmir occupy a liminal space that denies them both the status of a wife and dignity of a widow, relegating a liminal status of half mother to a grieving mother, Halima, is tantamount to blatantly dehumanizing her by placing her in subhuman category. Half mother, aka half human, can be described as anonymous, passive, a frozen being, marking her typically less than a grieving mother who is not entitled to information about her missing son. And this strategy of dehumanizing Halima by calling her half mother inherently involves feeling of unconnectedness, which serves to undermine a mother's right and entitlement to her son's protection and well-being. The Indian police and army fail to grasp a mother's common humanity or even her parenthood or a personhood. As Halima grumbles, and I quote, "We have become beggars, as you can see. Had they been killed by the army in front of us, we would have stayed put and silent throughout our lives, with no expectations, no hopes, no despair. But this longing is a pain, an eternal torture. It's not abated. It has not abated for a second. It kills us every day and resurrects us every morning to kill us again. Please feel for us," unquote. Despite confronting moral and ethical dilemma associated with living death duality of her son Imran, Halima challenges such labels imposed by dehumanizers. She rebuts a deliberate lack of clarity in the social status of half widows and half mothers in what advocate Farooq calls the legal language, which is meant to add to the ambiguity these women feel about their own identity. Therefore, emotionally, mentally, and physically devastated, Halima slides into schizophrenia and insomnia, but is shown to be unwilling to surrender. The unresolved loss of Imran and persisting ambiguity about his life-death status connect Halima with the community of the grieving families. She approaches official electronic media and BB journalists to get her tragic story published to expose what is not visible to the eye of mainstream media and what is deliberately kept invisible by the Indian state. Taking cue from Judith Butler's idea of performative subjectivity, Robbins flags up the ways in which the families of the disappeared empower themselves by becoming drivers of their own subjectivity when their voices, which is a kind of activism, go beyond private spaces to construct the very public meanings and identities through highly visible acts in streets and the squares. And such activism shows the potential for the families of the disappeared to have an impact on national discourse as political actors. And this is precisely what can be observed in case of Halima. Against all the odds, Halima transforms her grief in service of all those loved ones who have disappeared and struggles till her last breath, which not only affirms Halima's agency, but also challenges the narrative that victims of the trauma are passive and individual. I read Halima's performative construction of subjectivity as a gesture of transgressive act to undermine the stability of the state-performed violence against innocent people of Kashmir, especially the disappeared, as well as unmitigated violence against women. Halima, a domestic woman and a traditional mother, is forced to leave the comfort zone of private life and enter the public arena. Halima performatively subverts the hegemonic norms by which she and other families are constituted. And her steadfastness destabilizes the sole purpose of the perpetrator to render the families of the victim obedient to inveterate hostility, thereby challenging the possibility of treating half widows and half mothers as disenfranchised subhumans jettisoned from juridical modes of belonging. Kashmiri writers, I argue, are playing their role in rendering horror of illegal disappearances and incarceration visible through their fiction by resisting the way the contemporary human imagination has been hijacked by communications and media that produce a future on behalf of humanity, and by exposing bitter facts that are not getting exposure. But are we playing ours? I would conclude the paper with Dolgai's comment that if all the members of contemporary society are frozen in place, then complacency, collaboration, and implication by lack of resistance are the ultimate expressions of this frozenness. Thank you.
Aroosa, that was amazing, if fairly harrowing. There have been several requests for the author and title names. So perhaps you can drop them in the chat after we've finished talking, or you could email me and I'll tweet them out later. Mirza Waheed, the collaborator, was one. Feroz Rada, is it? Night of Broken Bones?
Yes, and Shehnaz Bashir.
Okay, if you could send them to me, we'll get them out so that people can follow up these references. I have many questions. There has been some kind of impassioned agreement with you in the chat, testifying to the thousands of Kashmiris reported to be killed by Indian security forces in custody, extrajudicial executions and forced disappearances. In short, kind of human rights violations that you are right to see as crimes against humanity, crimes against life. Abia also referenced the recent film Kashmir Files as an instance where the Indian state deliberately continues to demonize Muslims. You know, so a kind of state-sanctioned representation of this kind of invisibilized, erased context. Could you tell us a little bit more about, you know, you did touch on this towards the end of your paper, but in the face of such profound multivalent violence, military, discursive, scopic, you know, ontological, what can creative work ethically do? And, you know, is it just a case of bearing witness to the horror and kind of, you know, as such, combating this hijacking of the imagination that you say the Indian state is complicit in? Is there something beyond bearing witness? And even if there, you know, if that's all that can be done, are there particular, you know, literary or filmic genres, styles, forms which are ethically predisposed to this kind of bearing witness or this representing of the horrorism that you outline here?
Yeah, you know, I don't know. I will sort of, you know, begin by please, you know, sharing my experience, because I presented a paper on Kashmir in 2 or 3 different conferences in the UK when I was doing my postdoc. And honestly speaking, you know, I felt as if that people were more familiar with what is happening in Palestine and other parts of the world, but they were completely oblivious. And honestly, some of the people from America and the UK, they actually came and said to me that, you know, that we didn't know that, you know, such kind of atrocities are actually happening in Kashmir. So the writers are writing. And one interesting thing that we need to just focus on here is that I think most of the Pakistani and the Kashmiri writers, they're actually trying to reach out to the wider audience. And that is actually the reason why they're writing in English and why they're not writing in Kashmiri, why they're not writing in Urdu, because we are already familiar with all these atrocities that are happening, you know, in this particular territory. So it is actually a matter of reaching out to the wider audience. And so it's like kind of, you know, that making awareness, you know, creating an awareness, you know, among the larger community, the people who do not know anything about that. So this is precisely what I think. You know, when you talk about the media, when you talk about the press media, or you talk about sometimes the social media, interestingly, some of the posts, they get censored. You know, you can't post them anymore. I mean, I have recently posted something and I got a warning from the Facebook that, you know, for posting something which is kind of, you know, not appropriate, simply because I was using certain kind of terminology, like, you know, the way I'm using right now, human flesh, butchering, and that kind of very grim, gross kind of vocabulary that you cannot use probably openly in the media, in the social media, in the press media, or probably on television, and then it gets censored as well. Literature, I think, the creative genres, the creative forms, no matter whatever, whether you're talking about fiction, you talk about graphic novels, you talk about comedies, or whatever form of art, or the paintings, sculpture, whatever it is, I think these are the best sources to communicate these problems which we actually cannot talk about, especially in this part of the world where censorship is the major problem. Unfortunately, you can't talk. I mean, I can talk about all these things probably in my academic papers, in the conferences, but I cannot talk about these things probably if I go onto the media or if I just try to speak, you know, in a public event or something like that here in this part of the world. So yes, I think the creative genres, and the static genres, they are cultural forms. They are opening up, especially literature, fiction, nonfiction, fiction and the graphic novels and different kinds of genres. They are opening up the possibilities to talk about these horrors, really, in a much better way as the other, social medias, the print or other communication medias would allow.
So the Anglosphere in this context is seen as a kind of discursive site of resistance, presumably which cuts across kind of authors of Kashmiri heritage, but also some Pakistani and very selective Indian authors as well. I mean, Arundhati Roy is the example that will spring to all of our minds. Yeah. Faisal asks a question here. Sam is saying, as a Pakistani, she's found exactly the same thing as you in terms of the kind of general erasure of Kashmir from the conversation, any conversation about Muslim geographies. She asked a question, which I'll come back to, but Faisal says, you drew analogies in your introduction between India, Kashmir, Palestine, and Israel. Are there any continuities or discontinuities between different forms of violence inflicted on the body in these contexts? Faisal is also asking, to what extent is this the kind of afterlives of colonialism? I mean, there's sort of continuity here, I think, with partition politics, isn't there? You said at the beginning of your talk that nothing has changed in the last 20 years. So I guess the extended question is, has anything changed since 1947? So can you tease this out a little bit, kind of the historical continuities or discontinuities, and also your comparative dimensions with other places such as Palestine and Israel?
Yeah, as I said earlier, that one of the reasons that why I chose these different regions and why I chose like Syria, Iraq, Palestine, Kashmir, India. The reason why I'm just putting up all in one book is that one thing that connects all of them is that there is a kind of a dehumanization, and there is a less protest on the part of the rest of the world, honestly speaking. When we talk about, yes, probably Palestine is getting more and more attention, but as far as other, like, take the example of Syrian refugees or Iraqi refugees, or people are not actually responding to what is happening, or people do not talk about the way, these problems they should have been talked about. So one aspect which connects all of them is that there is a process of dehumanization when you're not treating them as human beings, when you're not taking care of their human rights, as I said, then it means that, the things are being neglected at many levels, on many, when you talk about the United Nations, again, when it comes to the matter of Kashmir, they say, oh, it's your internal affair. Or when we talk about the Muslim problems, people simply say, oh, it's your internal problem. So nobody kind of, pays heed to, and I'm not talking simply about the West. I mean, in my larger book project, I do talk about, for example, this silence on the behalf of the Arab states, the Middle East, and so many other, Muslim countries as well. So they have not been actually, So this is actually one of the reasons that the ways in which they are being silenced, and another very important thing, which normally people say that probably I'm always talking about, the problems which are imposed on Muslim people by the West. No. In my book, I'm actually talking about Muslim on Muslim violence as well. Because when we talk about the refugees, for example, Syrian refugees or Iraqi refugees, when they have gone to the Muslim world as well, so they have faced kind of humiliation and human rights abuse, even in those, countries as well. The camp lives, if you just observe the camp lives, whether we're talking about Afghanistan or Syria or any other place, so they are actually experiencing. So one common thing is that I'm talking about the Muslim population. Second important thing, that the ways in which they remain invisible. Third is the silencing. I mean, the term frozen has been used in multiple ways, in my paper. That is, it's just that, this, not only that the people are being frozen because they are unable to react because of the kind of horror, because of the kind of the torture that they're experiencing. On the other hand, there is a frozen response on the part of the spectators, the people who read the news, and then, you tend to sort of, forget. But then again, the idea of horror actually is framed according to this idea that you see something which is so disgusting, which is so horrifying, that you don't feel like as if talking about it. Is this one of the reasons? I mean, again, I'm not sort of, trying to use a Gothic genre or the paradigms of the Gothic genre, but I'm simply trying to understand the term horror in the light of what happens, why horror, what is the impact of horror on the characters, on the people, on the audience, and the spectators, etc.
I was thinking, well, as you were speaking, not only about the brevity of the news cycle, but also the kind of paralyzing effect of this extreme violence, I think.
Yeah.
We've just got time for two questions, which I'll roll in together so that we can have a quick break before the first panel. Sam asks then, do you think the use of allegory allows for intervention in some form in this case? And Amara asks, can we say that this is because sadly, creative genres are also used in the service of state discourse as well. So, is creative work to some extent complicit in these kinds of nationalist discourses, Indian in particular? And is allegory, does that remain a useful creative tool?
I think we have both the versions, honestly speaking, that there are people who are actually perpetuating this state-sponsored, as we have already talked about the native informants, and there are certain writers we label as kind of the people who are writing what is being sold in the West and what the West actually would like to hear about. But then I think the writers actually I'm talking about, like Mirza Wahid or Feroz Radar, they have, or Shahnaz Bashir, I think they have categorically, forgetting about the any affiliation, I think they have actually spoken in favor of, or for the innocent civilians, Kashmiri citizens who are suffering. So no matter, and again, consider their positionality, that all of them, they're based in one is based in UK, other is based in America. Even then, they feel, and they're providing us, the information about what is being happening. They're giving us a true picture of what is being happening. And I think if you remember that when on 5th of August, when the Indian state revoked the Article 370, and there was no internet, there was no connection of the inside world with the outside world. And even at that point, I think these writers, they were very active, even in their polemical writings, informing people about what is happening. So we do have both the categories, and I think, and then it gives you a multiple perspective. I think that we have the writers who are giving us a very inside perspective, and then the writers who are simply writing about kind of, orientalizing or re-orientalizing what we have been writing or we have been reading about these kind of regions. So yeah, so I would say that yes, we have both the categories, and they give us kind of, an alternative perspective to think about these regions and the problems which the people in these regions are facing.
Excellent. I'll give you one more question because this is so interesting. It's a shame to kind of curtail it. I suppose what you're saying through your use of horrorism is you're referring to what we were discussing yesterday, actually, which is sort of critical irrealism. Not just kind of using non-realist genres, but using them critically to expose something about what is supposedly normative. So Heba says, thank you for the interesting paper. I relate your argument on Kashmiri literature to Iraqi literature, specifically Hassan Blasim's nightmare realism. There we are, critical irrealism. Would you say that literary tropes of dehumanization take different modes according to geographical context? So I suppose, are there patterns that you perceive across the different contexts that you're looking at in terms of literary style? Big question.
Oh, yes, and a difficult one, honestly speaking, but I would say yes and no both. It depends, because I've read Palestinian literature, I've read a bit of Iraqi literature, but sometimes, the kind of butchery, or probably it also depends on, the rivalry between India and Pakistan, or the Bangladesh and these kind of regions. I really know it's kind of hard. I don't think that there is a lot of difference, but it's just that, the kind of reaction you have towards your enemy, it probably informs to what extent of butchery, to what extent of dehumanization you can go. I think, I'm sorry, I think it's hard for me to answer that, because we do have very brutal kind of, experiences of violence in some American or Western context as well.
I mean, it's a huge question to answer, and we will have to wait for your book to answer that, which of course will be precisely kind of mapping connections, but also the kind of specified differences across these contexts and the ways that writers themselves are kind of individualized and don't necessarily fit a sort of national current of creativity, particularly given, you know, many of these writers are writing in diaspora, they've chosen English for a particular reason. We shall have to end there, sadly. I suspect the conversation is going to continue in the chat, which is very welcome to do. Aroosa, if you could pop the author and title names in the chat for us, that would be hugely appreciated, and I'll tweet them as soon as I get a chance as well. Thank you so much for a kind of thematically grueling but incredibly interesting and powerful paper. That's been a wonderful addition to our conference, and in terms of the kind of coverage we've tried to get here. So thank you
so much for having me. It was a pleasure and honor.
And the electricity worked.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, everyone else.